They mocked his cheap crossbow because mockery is easier than measuring results. In armies built on lineage and display, a plain weapon invited judgment long before it ever loosed a bolt. Late in the campaigning season of 1347, as forces moved through the hedged farmland between Artois and Picardy, the war narrowed into something less visible than banners and battles, and that narrowing mattered more than most men understood. The fighting that year did not always arrive with drums or heralds. It crept along lanes, paused at fords, stalled in fields where rain had turned soil into paste. Armies did not collide all at once. They felt for each other first, through scouts, rumors, and missing men. In that environment, appearance still carried weight. A man's harness told others how he should be treated. A knight's armor was not just protection but proof. A well-finished sword spoke of patronage. A crossbow, especially one without ornament or complex spanning gear, spoke of wages paid late and status fixed low. The man who carried it was assumed to be useful but replaceable. He was not a knight, and no one mistook him for one. He wore serviceable mail, patched in places, and a wool surcoat without color or device. His crossbow had a simple wooden stock and a steel prod, strong enough for work, but not for admiration. No cranaquin hung from his belt. No horn plates gleamed along the tiller. To men who judged weapons the way they judged horses or cloaks, it looked like something borrowed or bought secondhand. Such judgments were not petty. They reflected how medieval armies actually functioned. Rank determined pay, rations, quarters, and whose voice carried weight. Men-at-arms with standing rode together and expected deference. Town soldiers and hired specialists were grouped, assigned, and dismissed with less ceremony. A crossbowman, unless attached to a lord's household or city contingent, lived in that uncertain space between necessity and neglect. Yet campaigns were not sustained by rank alone. They were sustained by information. Knowing which bridge stood, which road carried carts, which village still held grain, and which ridge hid movement mattered more than courage in open ground. That work fell to scouts. They rode ahead and to the sides, moving early and returning late. They read soil, smoke, broken hedges, and trampled verges. Their task was not glory but warning. Scouting demanded speed and assumption. Scouts assumed danger came from sudden contact, a lance from cover, a spear from a ditch, a blade in close quarters. Missile fire was expected at range, but not from stillness. A lone figure without a bowstring drawn rarely drew concern. A man on foot near a hedge was background, not threat. This was the gap between reputation and reality. The crossbowman understood it, because his place in the army forced him to. He was not called into councils. He was not posted with the vanguard. He was sent where patience mattered more than notice. The plainness of his gear helped him disappear into common ground. No one expected distinction from him, so no one watched him closely. The army itself moved like a long, uneven body. Wagons lagged, units compressed and stretched. Orders were repeated imperfectly. In such movement, certainty frayed quickly. When a scout failed to return, explanations came easily at first. A wrong turn, a horse lamed, a night spent sheltering. Loss was assumed only after absence accumulated. That assumption shaped behavior. Scouts rode as they always had. They took the same lanes because those lanes had worked yesterday. They passed the same hedges because nothing had happened there before. They trusted habit because habit usually paid. Inside the camp, the crossbowman remained unremarkable. His weapon was still cheap. His position was still low. He was not feared, not respected, and not asked for opinions. But the war was already shifting away from how men talked about him and toward how ground and timing answered him. The distance between mockery and consequence in medieval war was often short. It could be measured not in years or campaigns, but in days of movement, hours of daylight, and the silence left behind when a rider did not come back. But the first absence rarely changes behavior, and certainty only fractures after repetition begins. Scouting was the quiet labor that decided whether an army arrived hungry, late, or blind. It carried none of the honor promised to knights and none of the protection granted to household men. It required movement without noise, judgment without orders, and trust in habits formed through repetition rather than instruction. In northern France, During the middle decades of the 14th century, armies moved through land that was neither empty nor friendly. Fields were divided by hedges and ditches. Roads pinched between banks, built up over generations. Streams cut shallow but frequent lines across movement, forcing riders to choose known fords or risk delay. Villages sat close enough together that smoke could betray an army's direction long before banners were visible. Scouts rode to manage that uncertainty. They did not ride far ahead in a straight line. They fanned outward, probing lanes, checking bridges, counting carts, watching for signs that another force had passed recently. Hoofprints pressed into soft ground told stories to those who knew how to read them. Broken branches, flattened grass, disturbed ash in a hearth pit, all hinted at timing and direction. This work relied on rhythm. Scouts left early and returned before dark. They learned which paths were safe because they had been safe before. They judged danger by deviation. A gate closed that was usually open. A ford deeper than expected. Dogs barking where dogs had been silent. These details mattered more than armor or numbers. They also relied on speed. Scouts traveled light, often without full armor, to move faster and avoid fatigue in their mounts. They assumed that if they encountered resistance, it would be brief and loud. A shout, a clash, something that could be heard or seen from a distance. Silence did not register as threat. Silence meant nothing had happened yet. This assumption shaped behavior in ways few questioned. A lone figure on foot near a hedge did not prompt alarm. A stationary shape at the edge of a field blended into the landscape of peasants, woodcutters, and herdsmen. Scouts were trained to watch movement, not stillness. They expected danger to come toward them, not wait for them. The structure of medieval command reinforced this. Scouts were often drawn from men-at-arms or lightly equipped professionals. They were given general instructions, not constant oversight. They were trusted to know their routes. Reporting was verbal and delayed. There was no immediate correction when a path became dangerous. Only absence signaled failure. That absence at first was easy to excuse. Men did not always return on schedule. Weather slowed them. Horses threw shoes. Paths flooded. An army on the move created enough disorder that one missing rider did not register as crisis. Officers noted it, perhaps, but did not act. Meanwhile, the land itself offered cover to anyone patient enough to use it. Hedgerows were thick and irregular. Drainage ditches ran parallel to roads, shallow but concealing. Field banks rose just enough to hide a crouched figure. Woodland edges broke sightlines at short distances. A man who knew where scouts passed could position himself without being seen, especially if he did not move. The crossbow fit this environment precisely. It did not require long draw or sustained motion. It could be held ready without strain. It delivered force over short distances with certainty rather than speed. In a landscape that favored ambush, it rewarded waiting. Scouts did not change their behavior immediately because nothing told them to. No alarms were raised. No survivors reported contact. The absence of noise preserved routine. Riders continued to take the same lanes because those lanes were efficient. Efficiency in medieval logistics was survival. By the time repetition suggested intent rather than chance, habit had already shaped movement. The same routes had been ridden again and again. The same assumptions held. The ground had been rehearsed, not contested. This is how reconnaissance failed in practice. Not through ignorance, but through trust in what had worked before. Not through bravery, but through routine. The work of scouts was essential, but it rested on fragile expectations about how danger announced itself. Yet once loss replaces assumption, routine collapses faster than any formation on open ground. The first man did not return by nightfall, and that alone meant little. Riders were delayed all the time. A horse went lame. A stream rose after rain. A scout sheltered in a byre rather than risk the dark. His name was spoken once, then set aside, replaced by other concerns that pressed closer to the camp. It was only the next morning, when his track was followed and his horse was found without him, that the absence gained weight. The animal stood tied loosely near a hedge, reins slack, ears twitching. There was no sign of struggle, no broken gear. The saddle was still warm when they touched it. A short distance away, in the shallow angle where the road dipped, they found the man. The bolt had entered beneath the ribs, angled upward. Mail did not always fail, but it parted when a man leaned forward in the saddle, creating gaps that experience exploited. Death had been quick. There was no sign he had turned or shouted. No prints suggested pursuit. The ground told a simple story. He had ridden, slowed, and then fallen. They spoke of luck, a lucky shot, a peasant with a bow, someone hiding and running after. It was easier to imagine chance than design. The route was noted, but not closed. Scouts rode it again later that day. The second loss unsettled them more. This man was found near a field bank where the lane narrowed between hedges. He lay on his side, neck pierced cleanly at close distance. The wound suggested a shot taken from slight elevation, not far, not hurried. Again, there was no sign of warning. His horse had wandered off and been recovered hours later. 2 losses on adjacent routes prompted questions, but still not alarm. Men spoke of coincidence. The war was full of stray violence. Bands moved through the countryside. Deserters hid along roads. One could not change movement for every body found. Then came the pair. They were discovered together in a drainage ditch, where carts often bogged down after rain. One lay face down, already stiff. The other had dragged himself a short distance before stopping. He lived long enough to speak, not much. No description of attackers, no count, only that there had been no sound before the first man fell, and no time after. This changed the tone of the camp. 3 sites, close enough to suggest pattern, 4 days, too tight to dismiss. Officers ordered the routes marked. Scouts were told to ride in pairs. Still, no one could name the threat. There were no witnesses, no survivors, who had seen a figure move or heard a command. The absence of noise confused them. Medieval soldiers understood ambush, but ambush usually left signs. Broken branches, trampled grass, blood dragged from place to place. Here, there was only arrival and death. The bodies lay where they fell. The ground was otherwise untouched. This was not a raid. It was selection. The crossbowman did not need to chase. He needed only to know where scouts slowed, where lanes narrowed, where riders leaned forward to look ahead. He learned these places because the scouts taught him, passing the same way day after day. Their habits drew the map. Each shot required preparation. Bolts were short and heavy, meant for penetration, not range. He chose distances that reduced error. He waited until the horse's movement aligned the target. He fired once and did not linger. There was no benefit in being seen. The dead did not need confirmation. By the 4th day, 11 scouts were missing or found. The count itself mattered less than what it represented. The Army's eyes were being closed, one at a time, without contact. Patrols returned with less certainty. Reports grew vague. Paths were described but not taken. Movement slowed. Men began to look differently at the hedges. They watched field banks longer than the road ahead. Stillness, once ignored, drew attention. Silence no longer meant safety. Mockery stopped not because anyone admitted error, but because fear demands revision. The crossbowman remained unnamed in conversation, but the weapon like his was now spoken of with care. Cheap or not, it had done work that rank had failed to prevent. But fear rarely points cleanly toward truth, and the answers officers reached next were shaped by assumption as much as evidence. By the 5th morning, the Army moved as if the ground itself had turned unreliable. Orders were not changed all at once, but they bent under pressure. Scouts were told to ride closer. Patrols were widened, then pulled back again. Routes once taken without thought were discussed, argued over, and sometimes avoided altogether. This was the cost of absence. Medieval command relied on presence. A man reported, or he did not. There were no signals carried back instantly, no written tallies updated in real time. When scouts failed to return, officers worked backward, guessing at where and why, using yesterday's information to explain today's silence. The 4 days of loss created a compression effect. The Army's forward edge shrank. Patrol screens overlapped awkwardly. Men rode territory they had already checked because it felt safer than entering ground that had gone quiet. The result was not caution but blindness. Information narrowed as movement did. Horses suffered first. Repeated rides over the same tracks churned lanes into ruts. Mounts tired sooner. Farriers were called more often. Small delays multiplied. Wagons closed distance on units ahead of them, tightening the column. The army became denser, slower, and louder. Officers demanded answers, but there were few to give. The bodies told little beyond placement. No one had seen attackers gather or withdraw. No village had reported men passing through in force. Supplies were not missing. Livestock was untouched. This did not fit the pattern of a band or raiding party. Some suspected betrayal. A local guide, perhaps, marking routes. A deserter selling knowledge. These explanations were familiar because they placed responsibility on people, not on terrain. Orders were given to question camp followers, to watch guides more closely. Nothing came of it. Others argued that enemy troops were probing ahead of their main force, using light detachments to thin the screen. This too made sense within known practice. Yet no larger movement followed. No banners appeared, no camps were discovered. The pressure remained localized and precise. The crossbowman needed none of this speculation. He measured success by effect, not explanation. The effect was visible. Riders passed his chosen lanes less often. When they did, they came in pairs or threes. They spoke loudly. They watched the hedges. Their pace changed. This did not end the danger. It altered it. More men on the road meant more noise, more distraction, more opportunities for hesitation. The crossbow favored certainty. He waited longer. He let targets pass until the alignment felt right. He accepted that fewer shots might yield greater disruption. In medieval warfare, delay was a weapon, an army that slowed and lost initiative. It arrived late to favorable ground. It consumed supplies meant for later days. It gave its enemy time to react. None of this required open battle. Records from the period show how often campaigns stalled, not because of defeat, but because movement became too costly. Roads mattered. Weather mattered. Information mattered. When one of these failed, the others followed. Within the camp, behavior changed quietly. Jokes stopped. Men stopped wandering beyond the perimeter. Guards were doubled at night, even though the threat came by day. Crossbows were no longer laughed at when they appeared among the ranks. No one praised them either. They were acknowledged, which in an army built on hierarchy was a shift of its own. The losses were counted now, not excused. 11 names, spoken in order, attached to routes and times. The pattern was visible, even if the cause remained obscured. The army's forward motion had been reshaped without a single clash of lines. This was the power of repetition. One death could be chance. 2 could be misfortune. 11 over 4 days forced adjustment. The land had become hostile, not through occupation, but through use. Still, adjustment did not bring understanding, and the search for explanation led officers toward familiar errors. Once fear took hold, the army looked for causes it already understood. Medieval commanders were trained by experience, not theory. They interpreted events through patterns they had seen before, and those patterns shaped both inquiry and response. The first assumption was organized resistance. Light enemy troops, perhaps mounted sergeants or men-at-arms, might be operating ahead of their main force. Such probing was common. Small detachments could harass, delay, and withdraw without committing to battle. Orders were given to watch for signs of camps, picket fires, or supply movement. None were found. The second assumption was disorder. Bands of armed men roamed war zones constantly. Deserters, dismissed soldiers, and locals pushed into violence by scarcity formed temporary groups that preyed on movement. These groups left signs: looted carts, stolen animals, frightened villages. Yet here, nothing was missing. No complaints arrived from nearby settlements. The violence remained narrow and selective. Suspicion then turned inward. Guides were questioned. Camp followers were watched. Men who knew the roads too well drew attention. This response reveals how medieval armies understood risk. Betrayal felt more plausible than a single soldier acting alone. Responsibility was easier to assign when it had a face. The idea that one man, using terrain and patience, could shape movement so decisively did not fit the period's mental framework. Individual skill was respected in combat, but disruption was expected to come from groups. Organization implied numbers. Numbers implied visibility. This misjudgment delayed effective response. Routes were altered without understanding why the original ones had become dangerous. Patrols were reinforced without addressing predictability. Men rode closer together. but they still rode the same hours, the same lanes, and the same pauses. The crossbowman exploited this. He did not seek escalation. He avoided moments when riders scanned hedges actively. He waited for fatigue to dull attention. He allowed fear to redirect movement into narrower spaces where hesitation replaced speed. Crossbows carried a particular reputation in this context. They were associated with sieges, walls, and set positions. They were not imagined as tools for mobile disruption. A plain crossbow, especially one without elaborate spanning gear, was dismissed as short-ranged and slow. That dismissal shaped expectations. In reality, the weapon's limits aligned with its use. Short range reduced error. Slow reload encouraged restraint. A single shot, chosen carefully, had greater impact than hurried fire. This was not marksmanship as spectacle, but as calculation. Records from medieval campaigns frequently note delays without clear cause. Movements halted, marches shortened, plans altered because information failed to arrive. Rarely do these records explain how that failure occurred. The absence of scouts is noted, but the mechanism is not. In this case, the mechanism remained invisible because it was small. No banners, no shouted commands, no pursuit. The crossbowman left nothing behind that could be tracked. He did not need to retreat far. The hedges closed behind him. The lanes looked unchanged. Fear magnified the effect. Men spoke more than they watched. Riders scanned the wrong spaces. Officers demanded reports that could not be given. Each adjustment assumed a threat larger and louder than the one actually present. By the end of the fourth day, the Army's leadership had decided they faced an organized effort, though evidence remained thin. This conclusion justified caution, but obscured reality. The true threat remained unnamed and unaddressed. This is how misjudgment operated in medieval warfare. Not through ignorance, but through reliance on familiar explanations. Commanders acted rationally within their understanding, even as that understanding lagged behind events. Yet the lasting impact of the episode lay not in mistaken theories, but in the consequences that followed, regardless of explanation. The scouts were not replaced quickly. Men could be reassigned, but experience could not. Those who knew the lanes, the fords, and the rhythms of the countryside had learned them over months and years. Their absence left gaps that no order could immediately fill. The army moved on, but it moved differently. Routes were chosen for caution rather than speed. Marches shortened. Columns stayed tighter, even when space allowed them to spread. These choices carried cost. Supplies arrived later. Horses tired sooner. Opportunities passed without being taken because no one could say with confidence what lay ahead. None of this appeared dramatic in record or memory. There was no decisive clash to mark the change. No named battle. Yet such shifts shaped campaigns more reliably than single days of fighting. Medieval war was sustained by movement. When movement slowed, everything else followed. The crossbowman did not need recognition for this to occur. He did not need to be known. His role ended not with capture or escape, but with effect achieved. Once patrols withdrew and routes changed, his work was finished. The weapon that had been mocked returned to obscurity, having already altered the course of decisions. This episode reflects a broader truth about medieval warfare. Power did not always announce itself through rank or display. It often worked quietly through logistics, timing, and denial of information. Weapons mattered not only for how they killed, but for how they shaped behavior. Crossbows occupied an uneasy place in medieval society for this reason. They blurred lines. They allowed men without lineage to exert force at a distance. They rewarded patience over bravado. Their reputation for cruelty or unfairness speaks less to their mechanics than to the discomfort they caused within established hierarchies. The lesson carried beyond the campaign. Armies learned to guard their scouts more closely. Routes were varied when possible. Commanders became more cautious about predictable movement. These adaptations appear gradually in records, not as reforms, but as habits learned the hard way. For those who lived through such moments, the memory was not of the dead themselves, but of the uncertainty that followed, of roads that felt unsafe, of silence that demanded attention, of the realization that control could be lost without a fight. This is why episodes like this matter. They reveal how survival depended on restraint and understanding as much as courage. They show how overlooked tools and overlooked men could influence events without ever entering the center of the story. If there is a lesson to carry forward, it is this. In any system built on hierarchy and display, effectiveness often hides where no one is looking. Responsibility lies not only in command, but in attention. Those who fail to respect small, quiet forces do so at their own cost.